Pendulums are one of the most controversial mechanics in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Rising to the height of dominance to now one of the most unplayed Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies, today I'm going to be explaining why everyone hates Pendulum and what Konami can do to fix it. Let's go ahead and jump on in. So if Pendulums had an analogy, it would easily be either the youngest child or the middle child that often gets left into the shadows and sometimes lashes out. But if you look at the underlying causes of this retaliation, this could have been prevented if it had the right parenting. Pretty much looking at you, Konami, you really fumbled the bag when it comes to Pendulums. Understandably, it is the younger brother to Fusion, Synchro, and Xseed, and all three of those mechanics have their own problems in their own right, but at least those are still majorly being utilized to this day. I even made a video about the eventual death of Synchro monsters that I think you guys should check out. It goes on to detail talking about how flawed the Synchro mechanic is and how it can be fixed. But even in today's standards, for being a 2008 mechanic, it still is faring pretty well, where Pendulum has not. I mean, pretty much outside of one deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now carrying the entire mechanic on its back, Pendulum is essentially dead. But I think it's best to go ahead and dial it back and explain why everyone hates this mechanic and why it's at the status that it is today. Pendulums made their debut in 2014 with the Space Time starter deck, and this introduced two of the very first Pendulum monsters in Stargazer and Time Gazer Magician. Both of these cards were supposed to be the start of a new era, but unfortunately, they received mixed results. Now, in this particular era, Pendulum is a little bit different than what we currently see it as today. It's almost like if Pendulum was that middle brother and you were growing up looking at him, he is a lot different than what he is now than what you've seen him as. You probably even looked up to him before because of how powerful he was. At this time, Pendulums had their own unique zones, meaning that you can play 5 spells and trap cards into your spell and trap card zones and still have these particular cards to use. Also, Pendulums could be summoned freely from the hand in extra deck every single turn, and it did not have any type of zone restrictions, meaning that every single time your Pendulum monsters were destroyed and went to the extra deck, you can summon every single one of them right back to your side of the field. Now, outside of that, Pendulums pretty much still work the exact same, treating themselves as Pendulum spells and gaining their spell effect there, and having their monster effect being used everywhere else. And then, of course, you can only summon monsters from your hand and extra deck in between the scales of Pendulum monsters. Now, with both Stargazer and Time Gazer Magician out, Konami gave you a brand new way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! But didn't force you to play these particular cards, unlike what Konami did for both Xseeds and Synchro. Take, for example, when Synchros were introduced, they were so powerful, you just had to play them inside of your deck, with monsters like Stardust Dragon making cards like Mirror Force and Sakuretsu Armor almost obsolete, and then Synchro monsters like Black Rose Dragon giving you an instant Dark Hole and Heavy Storm. And Dark Hole at this time was banned. These cards were so powerful, if you did not use them inside of your deck, you were immediately put at a huge disadvantage. And when Xseeds were introduced, Konami made it a point to ban some of the most powerful tuner monsters in the game, and then even released cards that were really good against Synchro monsters. Steelstorm Roach and Orient Dragon came out around that time, and they were incredibly powerful against that particular mechanic. Konami's approach to Pendulum was the complete opposite. Instead of hitting both Synchros and Xseeds, they decided to do absolutely nothing. And with these two Pendulum monsters being incredibly underwhelming and dependent on one another, as well as no other Pendulum cards in existence, this proved to be absolutely disastrous for the mechanic. Not even a full month later, Konami released what is considered by most as one of the best Yu-Gi-Oh! Sets of all time in Duelist Alliance. This particular set strengthened all of the other mechanics. The Fusion mechanic got its very first breakthrough and got arguably one of the most iconic Fusion strategies of all time in shit all. But the Xseed monsters would not be outdone. Not only did they get their iconic strategy of their own in Burning Abyss, they also doubled down with the TheCaliEffect strategy. And if you guys don't think that TheCaliEffect has a loyal fan base, there is one guy that has been flooding my DMs about TheCaliEffect. He will not give up. Even Synchro got cards that are still being used today in Yang Zine. Pendulums, on the other hand, did not receive any cards to make them remotely viable. Crazily enough, most players that experience this format say that without question, this is one of the best formats of all time. And a little bit of poetic justice, it's actually the last format where Pendulums just simply could not exist. And if you look at this from the sibling perspective, it's almost like your parents bringing all of your brother's new toys and giving you an Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon. So basically, you get a PS5, you get an Xbox, you get get a PC with pendulums? You get Odd Eye's Pendulum Dragon. The three older mechanics dominated Yu-Gi-Oh! For 3 entire months, with Pendulum becoming an afterthought, but that was set to change. On November 7, 2014, we got our very first taste of what happens when this brother lashes out. Now here's where I think that the parents did a really terrible job. Unfortunately, the 3 months of Pendulum watching the other mechanics flourish made it incredibly jealous and take it a little bit too far. The younger brother's rebellion with Cliffor wasn't just an attack on the other strategies, it was a complete attack on Yu-Gi-Oh! Itself. See, Pendulum monsters have a unique ability to go to the extra deck as opposed to being sent to the graveyard. When players figured out that removing Pendulum monsters off the field would not send powerful trap cards like Vanity's Emptiness to the graveyard, and that they can remove the stat penalty reduction of their Cliffor monsters with Skill Drain, this became a deck that could strip down Yu-Gi-Oh! To its very core basis, but seeing that the Cliffor monsters are naturally stronger than any other monster that could be summoned, it became a completely unfair advantage for Cliffor in Pendulum play. Pendulums became one of the most unfair and toxic mechanics seemingly overnight due to the worst traits of cards being brought out because of this strategy. And being able to Pendulum summon all of the monsters that your opponent got rid of when they finally were able to get rid of your Floodgate trap cards was just a cherry on top. Now, I remember specifically where I was at the time that Clifforts came out. Looking at a strategy that could special summon a ton of monsters, but also could tribute summon and prevent your opponent from using effects as well as special summon, I thought that that was the top of power creep. Boy, was I wrong. Clifforts eventually settled down with numerous hits to the strategy itself, but also the banning of key toxic cards, which eventually fixed the balance and allowed other non-Pendulum type Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks to be able to thrive again. But if you thought that your brother was done throwing a tantrum and that's the absolute worst thing he could do, you couldn't have been more mistaken. See, the problem with the Pendulum mechanic is that it was very poorly designed. It's way too volatile. The reason why players hate the mechanic so much is because when it does become competitive, it's usually unfairly competitive. At its core nature, the mechanic replenishes all of its resources for free and also has monsters that become immediately useful as spell cards. The innate drawback to monster cards is that if you can't use them in their monster capacity, they become almost useless unless you can bring them to your side of the field. And then when your opponent finally does get rid of them, you need some special type of way to bring them back. Pendulum just simply ignores both of those concepts. And when Konami introduced the Pendulum mechanic, they said it was built to be able to mesh all of the other mechanics together. It was just a walking, ticking time bomb waiting to happen. Make no mistake, during this time, the other mechanics did have their time to shine. Essentially, when Pendulums wasn't being the dominant deck throwing a tantrum, every other mechanic got to eat. Even ritual monsters became one of the more powerful decks inside of the format. Nekros became one of the most dominant forces in Yu-Gi-Oh! History during the Pendulum mechanic era, but it was only inevitable for Pendulum to throw another tantrum when it got the right support. And it actually got the right support. In January 2016, the Breakers of Shadow set released. This set did give support to the other 3 mechanics, powerful Xseed monsters like Cyber Dragon Infinity and Traptrix Rafflesia. It also gave Synchro Infusion some pretty good cards, as well as Solemn Strike. But the easy steal of this entire set is the Performapal monsters and how transformative that these cards are going to be on everything we see for the Pendulum mechanic. See, up until this set, the Pendulum strategies were just Pendulum strategies. Cliffor played mostly Cliffor cards, Pendulum Magician played mostly Pendulum Magician cards. But with cards like Performapal Monkey Board and Guitar Turtle, something clicked inside of Pendulum players. Because the Pendulum mechanic didn't have any restrictions of playing these cards together, and you can mix and match the best cards from every Pendulum mechanic, a strategy called Performapal Performage, better known as PePe, was born. Now, PePe not only took the best cards from the Pendulum mechanics, such as the Magispectors, the Draco Slayers, the Magicians, the Performapals, and the Performages, it actually just took the best cards. Because this deck easily spammed monsters at a faster rate than any other deck, it had access to monsters like Traptrix Rafflesia, Cyber Dragon Infinity, and later even Naturia Beast and Elder Entity Norden. All of these cards combined to make PePe a complete powerhouse. So powerful, Konami had to introduce an emergency ban list to ban the strategy from competitive tournament play. Only roughly 2 weeks after the set dropped. This is easily one of the biggest impacts that Pendulum has had on the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, because after that adjustment list, we never received a hard date to ever get a ban list again. It was pretty much Konami throwing in the white flag, admitting that any given time a set drops, Pendulums could take over and be one of the most ridiculous decks if they made a mistake. You would think that after this incident, Konami would have learned from allowing Pendulums to have access to powerful generic cards. But unfortunately, Pendulum would continue to be a combo-oriented Yu-Gi-Oh deck. The mechanic would continue to make unfair situations for Yu-Gi-Oh players playing against it if the strategy was allowed to do what it does, which was pretty often since the only hand traps were Effect Failure and Ghost Ogre at the time. Eventually, Konami would step in and introduce a rule change named Master Rule 4, which would hit the mechanic incredibly hard. These rule changes would take the Pendulum zones away and move them into the Spell and Trap card zone, and force players that are Pendulum summoning from the extra deck to only be able to summon to where link arrows point to of a link monster. This pretty much meant that the entire Pendulum mechanic was at the mercy of whatever link cards would come out, and effectively making link monsters like what Synchros was in its era and Exceeds were in its era, the go-to card and the must-play card. Now, growing up, I'm pretty sure you and a sibling have been punished by a parent, and maybe it was a little bit too harsh. Sometimes your parent would even regret it and even give you a treat as a way to apologize. Pendulums took that treat way too far. Just when everyone thought that Pendulums were completely done, Konami released a monster named Heavy Metal Foes Electrumite in an attempt to revive the Metal Foes monsters, but unfortunately, this gave a revival to the entire mechanic. And to double down, reinforced all of the toxic traits that were instilled into them. Pendulum once again dominated the card game with FTKs, also known as first turn kills, using monsters like Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. And then even when that was put to a stop, it summoned some of the most frustrating and unbeatable monsters in combination with each other. And this is one of the biggest reasons why people just simply hate Pendulum. The strategy is simply like that sibling that is really docile until your parents tell you you have to do whatever that sibling does. And once it does get that power, it brings out some of the most toxic and painstaking ways of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game. A lot of people actually attribute Pendulum to power creep and why Yu-Gi-Oh is the way it's now. Because keeping up with Pendulum strategies meant that Konami had to release more powerful cards, which eventually got us to where we are today. And as much as I try to be fair and defend Pendulum, some things are incredibly obvious with the rule changes that Konami has done against Pendulum and has done for other mechanics. Now, not only was Heavy Metal Foes Electrumite banned, alongside of a host of other cards to make sure that Pendulums could never dominate the TCG again, in 2020, Konami revised Master Rule 4 to allow Exceeds, Fusions, and Synchro monsters to be special summoned from the extra deck without having to point to a Link monster. This was pretty much a nail in the coffin, as the other mechanics didn't have to rely on Link monsters and had an unfair advantage of being able to be summoned and utilized however players wanted. And then it also meant that Exceeds, Synchros, Fusion, and Link monsters could eventually become what Pendulum was back in the day, summoning unbeatable monsters but with less restriction. I just find it ironic that the same type of boards that players were making at the height of Pendulum is now pretty standard in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And even with Heavy Metal Foes Electrumite off the list in the OCG and Master Duel, the mechanic still struggles to keep up with those type of strategies. Pendulums are simply that brother that is misunderstood. For so long, it was hated for doing the things that players do in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now. Maybe it was a little bit ahead of its time, maybe it should have had more restrictions by Konami. It suffers from a huge identity crisis. There's no real such thing as a Synchro, Exceed, or Fusion deck. When I say those particular things, you can actually point out strategies in mind. Sword Soul, Branded, Burning Abyss. But when you say Pendulum, it pretty much fixes it. It's just a collaboration of Pendulum cards trying to band together to keep up. Now, fortunately enough, fixing Pendulum is pretty simple. Because Pendulums are so powerful, they need a restriction from being able to combine so well. Kind of like how the other mechanics can be played with one another, but can't match some of the best cards all into one deck. Building up the strategies to be their own powerful deck with their unique capabilities would be the next best thing. And the last way to fix the mechanic doesn't necessarily have to do with the mechanic itself, but has to do more with Konami. For the love of God, please stop making generic Yu-Gi-Oh cards that one particular mechanic can take an unfair advantage of that other strategies cannot. And also for my Pendulum players, I know you guys are waiting to hear this. Free my nigga Electrumite. He did nothing wrong.